Continuing with interactions with selection, the next possibility is selection instrumentation. And this is where one group typically scores around the ceiling or floor and the other does not. So while one group may experience a floor effect, the other may not. So that's once again another example of how two of the factors that we've already mentioned can interact with one another. The next is ambiguity about the direction of causal influence. As you recall, in passing, when discussing the correlational design, the correlational research design, one of the limitations that we talked about was correlation does not imply causation. If you have two variables that have been measured concurrently or are analyzed together as x and y variables concurrently, the question remains as to, well, did x cause y or did y cause x? The truth is that both explanations in that research design remain plausible and possible. The example that we gave is job satisfaction and job performance. If you come up with a correlation, a statistically significant positive correlation between those two constructs, job satisfaction and job performance, the explanation that might be given is that someone who is satisfied with their job is perhaps motivated to perform at a high level, and therefore you see that increases in job satisfaction lead to increases in job performance. However, the converse is also possible, where a person who's achieving at a high level, accomplishing in whether it's objective data such as sales or customer service, it's possible that that person may be satisfied with their job because they have been successful. Or another form of measurement of performance is subjective measurement, where it's measured by a supervisor in a performance appraisal. So if a person received a positive performance appraisal, then that individual might be inclined to report high levels of job satisfaction. The two perhaps go hand in hand with one another, but the question is one of direction. Does job satisfaction cause job performance, or vice versa? Either possibility is plausible. In order to somehow come up with a more definitive answer, then you have to put it through a traditional experimental design where you have a control group and a treatment group, and if you could somehow tease away or parse out aspects like self-selection, then you might have a way of measuring that. Diffusion or imitation of treatments. Just continuing on the handout that I gave. Let's say you have two groups, one getting the treatment and the other not. One gets classroom training on a topic. The other group is just told to read a book. Even if subjects are initially randomly assigned to groups, what's going to happen in the midday when both groups are given their break and find themselves in the Burger King or some other fast food joint talking about how their morning went? What might very well happen is that the groups may talk with one another. They know that they're in some sort of study conducted by a university or other researcher. But it becomes perhaps evident to some that some of them are getting classroom training and some are just told to read a book or research it on the internet. So the result is that we don't have as clear of a distinction between the two groups, between the group that got the classroom training and the group that was told to read the book. We don't have that clear of a distinction between those two groups anymore that could lead us to a conclusion about the quality of the program. Next, we have compensatory equalization of treatments. This is also similar to what we just mentioned with diffusion or imitation of treatments, but as we know, stakeholders can play a role in the resources allocated. Optimally, the control group gets none of the treatment, either a placebo or something that's very innocuous. However, part of the way through the program, the control group may have certain unplanned funds or another intervention that will compromise the pureness of the control group. And this goes back many years to the Tuskegee studies, where there was an interest in researching a certain disease, and what happened after they took some initial measures of these individuals, there was a treatment for that disease that came to the fore. So the question that the scientists had was, if you look at it from a pure scientific point of view, you want to maintain the purity of the treatment and not allow that experimental drug to enter into the study. And so it was, and the problem that that resulted was an ethical one, is that they withheld treatment that, at least according to some initial research studies, might have helped those individuals health-wise, but they kind of were purists about it. So compensatory equalization of treatments means that a person or the researcher might want to introduce a variable that will kind of put both groups on an equal footing with one another. The opposite is kind of compensatory rivalry by respondents receiving less desirable treatments. The control group may figure out that they're in the control group, and therefore they might want to engage in self-fulfilling prophecy, which you probably have all heard of, and they say to themselves, okay, if we're the control group, then we're going to act like the control group. And that is a compensatory rivalry. I'm sorry, I was jumping ahead. Compensatory rivalry is where the control group realizes that they're the control group and then tries to do better. Kind of similar to a Hawthorne effect, but they try to keep on pace with the treatment group. I was jumping ahead, but where I was headed was resentful demoralization of respondents receiving less desirable treatments. And that's where you have the control group figuring out that they're the control group and maybe considering themselves as second-class citizens. And as such, they may engage in a self-fulfilling prophecy and do poorly on the measure that's being used. What we get from all of this is the shortcomings of where you have a single group, or sometimes a multiple group situation, where there's no random assignment, and or there are other factors that have to be entertained that happen between the pre and the post test. As a result, we have these threats to internal validity. Some other related issues. Another possible misinterpretation of research is hindsight bias, and this is where the results of the analysis are inconsistent with the hypotheses and a priori predictions. Then the evaluator will go and weave a compelling alternative explanation for why the data turned out the way they did. The book recounts a story where this happened, and the professor developed a different approach to the data, when in fact the original data analysis had been incorrect. So you have to be careful, and you obviously have to have some integrity as a researcher. Previously, we've discussed construct validity as an approach to the validity of a psychometric instrument. We can apply this principle to how respondents interpret items or questions contained in the instrument that's presented to them. The existence and the interpretation of apparent change based on what instrument you're using also has to be considered. Here there are three types of change, and we know these types of change by the Greek letters of the first three letters of the alphabet: alpha, beta, and gamma. Those are three types of change which can be experienced in self-report, meaning a measure that's completed by the respondent, him or herself, that can be experienced in self-report measurements of change. Alpha change is when in fact there is real change in the behavior of interest. Beta change is when respondents change their interpretation of what the scale represents. As a result, you may not be measuring what you believe you are measuring. For example, a self-esteem training program where participants are measured prior to the start of the program. At that time, they may have one definition of self-esteem, and that might be being hard on themselves. After the program, when filling out the same survey, they may be using a different conceptualization of self-esteem that is maybe less hard on themselves. So it could be that it wasn't the program per se that influenced their level of self-esteem as intended, as much as it was the changed operational definition of self-esteem. So that's beta change. Gamma change is where the respondent's conceptualization of the variable changes. It could be that before the diversity training that we're considering, respondents thought that diversity meant mandatory quotas, affirmative action, and preferential treatment. We know that, generally speaking, affirmative action, diversity training does not promote that. But after the program, respondents could think of affirmative action in a more enlightened way. So those are factors you have to consider when looking at measurement.